My name is Peter Hylands. I'm the president of the Australian Wildlife Protection Council, and that's an organisation that's been going for about 50 years. And I think the history of the council has been in fighting, and I use the word fighting because that's necessary, fighting to protect Australia's wildlife. I've been president now for about 6 months, I suppose. And that has come about because in much of the work we've done in Australia, we have travelled the continent extensively. So we know a lot about what goes on in, a huge range of diverse places, from the Torres Strait, which is Melanesian culture, right through many Aboriginal communities, and, into the big cities, across the deserts, across the rainforests, across the mountains. So it is that knowledge that I can contribute to the council. And what I do is I write a lot of stories about nature nowadays. And you can see those on our film company website, which is called Creative Cowboy Films. And that has become quite an important resource. It's like a keeping house, if you like, of Australian knowledge. And it is used by universities, educational organisations and the general public. And what we do is we make documentaries, so they're anywhere between half an hour and an hour. And you'll see there's a lot of documentaries with Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders. We work in Japan a lot, for example, so it's sort of an international thing. But we do a lot of work with Indigenous people. And a lot of these people are great artists. They're very closely connected to the earth. And, we work in Africa, so we have many Maasai friends, for example, a big Maasai family. And we look at the lives of people and how they relate to the earth and to the natural world. I think it's a human rights thing. It's an animal rights thing. One of the key things we've tried to do, because we spent a lot of time travelling around the world, is we believe very strongly in bringing cultures together. So that whole idea of connecting cultures, of telling people about someone's culture. And if you look at Australia, for example, the history of Indigenous people in Australia has not been great. And I think any kind of friendships and knowledge we can create, bridges we can create across those gaps, historical gaps, if you like, since European settlement of Australia, then I think that's a very powerful thing to be doing. And it's passing that knowledge on and the friendships between people that I think is so important. And in that work, you learn a lot about animals. And you learn a lot about, the way different cultures regard their place. So in Australia, for example, let's stay in Australia here. The colonisers regard the land as something to be conquered. That's the kind of mentality of it, the overarching mentality. So Australia becomes a farm, it becomes a mine, it becomes a place of deforestation, it becomes a place where you can actually screw up the Great Barrier Reef and not worry about it too much. It becomes a place where you can screw up the Great Artesian Basin and not worry about it too much, because you don't actually think about the future. And these are serious issues that Australian European culture is still struggling with. Not every European or settler Australia, if you like, non-Indigenous Australia, wants to see the place destroyed. And that's becoming a growing movement. And I think anything we can do to invest in encouraging, the safe passage of whatever's left in Australian nature, in Australian culture, then that's a good thing. You may have noticed that last week, incredibly important Indigenous site going back 40,000 years plus was blown up in Western Australia by the mining company Rio Tinto. Now, that has been typically what has gone on in Australia. And Western Australia has been particularly bad in these matters. So if you go to, it's like thinking about Lascaux, I suppose. If somebody went in there with a stick of dynamite and blew those caves up, there'd be a huge fuss. And what happens in Australia, and it goes on and on and on, is many of these historical sites are destroyed. And what that does, the people who are closely connected to these places, who've been the guardians of these places for thousands of years, it actually makes them very sick to see this, physically sick to see this destruction going on. So it's a horrible sort of psychological and physical abuse of the Indigenous people through these acts. And trying to stop these things is incredibly hard. And I think when we look at one of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is to get Australians to understand, and try and do this globally too, that because people don't know what's happening to their natural world, they don't quite understand the processes that are at work. I'm in Melbourne at the moment, and in Victoria, there are things called authorities to control wildlife. Now, the Victorian government issues permits to kill about 80 native species. And that in itself is profound. The number of animals being killed, Australian native wildlife being killed, a lot of those animals are birds, has probably almost doubled. If you take the last 4 years and compare it to the 4 years previously. So this is getting a lot worse. And in Australia, in Victoria, the kangaroo pet food industry is now making inroads into macropod populations, kangaroo populations. This is an incredibly cruel industry. Basically, what happens is they do surveys, they extrapolate the numbers counted, and they create some number which we do not believe is correct. And then they go and target those animals. And there's a whole load of marketing spin behind why this is all okay. And so if we look at macropods and related species in Victoria, when the Victoria was settled, there were 16 species here. Now, 7 of those species are extinct, and I would put perhaps 3 or 4 others teetering on the brink of extinction. Now, when we talk about extinction, we're talking about regional extinctions, or we're talking about total extinctions. So what typically happens in Australia is that if a species was very widespread across the continent, and that certainly happened in some of the arid species, many of which are now completely extinct. We're talking about mammal species here. Their distribution was huge, so they covered a vast area. Over the period of farming of introduced animals, we see a continual contraction of where these animals are living. So their populations are increasingly fragmented, and the regions they're living in the areas they're living in are becoming increasingly smaller. And obviously that's a very bad thing genetically, but that is the road to extinction. And that is happening to many, many, many species in Australia. And The tension comes about when they've reached the edge of the cliff, they've been pushed there knowingly for decades, and then people suddenly worry about, these things are going to go extinct. That's not the way to do these things. The way to do it is to look after the environment in the first place, give those animals some rights, and make sure they have a passage into the future. I mean, there are so many of them, but I suppose one of the things that I'm trying to tackle as president is cultural attitudes towards wildlife. It is trying to get people to understand what is happening to these animals, and it is trying to get people to respect these animals. Believe it or not, and what I'm telling you is completely accurate, Australian governments of all persuasions spend a lot of time denigrating Australian species. So basically, they think they're pests. They align themselves with industries like the kangaroo industry, and then they accordingly market the idea that these animals are dangerous, they destroy infrastructure. I mean, that's a very strange thing to say. There's a whole series of kind of statements that coming from governments that suggest that these animals perhaps shouldn't be there in the landscape. Now, what happened during the fires, and this you will find remarkable, is that in New South Wales and in Victoria, both of these governments blocked the rescue of Australian native wildlife from those public fire grounds. So I'm talking about national and state parks here. So they actually blocked the rescue of these animals. And if we look in Victoria, in the end, from these incredibly badly burnt places where, we can say 1.2 billion, and we're talking about mammals, reptiles and birds here. We're not talking about amphibians and fish and insects. So you can imagine these numbers are astronomical, as were the size of the fire grounds. In the end, in Victoria, something like 350 wild animals were rescued from those vast public areas. I'm not talking about private land, because there are a lot of people who went out and rescued animals. But it is this kind of behaviour, and one of the issues that the government has is in trying to issue ATCWs, trying to promote the kangaroo industry, always defending the killing and the destruction of the environment. It looks very strange if they're suddenly rescuing them. And I mean, I made the point to politicians in Victoria that not rescuing koalas from the fires would be a really bad international look, particularly when money poured in from around the world to help these animals. So what occurred of those 350 animals rescued from those fire grounds, they were rescued by the government staff, basically, or by people they asked to assist, which is not the usual rescue teams who are the professionals in doing this. I think about 3/4 of those animals were koalas, so it was a bit of window dressing going on here, just to make them look good. And that's the sort of behaviour that is not acceptable. And that's the sort of behaviour that the world needs to know about. Mm. And I think I've been dealing with these matters for 45 years in Australia. I'm a European, obviously. But, now, I don't think I've ever had a letter from any government or any environment department across Australia saying, yes, you're right, Peter. We think these things are terrible. The attitude is always to defend them. And, I can show you endless letters. You can you can have some of them if you want. And it demonstrates a kind of an attitude towards the natural world. And that is precisely what needs to change. If you look at the forest country that burnt in Victoria, this time it was to the east of the state. Now, that fire then also, the spread of the fire, not the spread of the fire, but the area that was burnt carried up on the New South Wales coast, across inland and up into Queensland. So the fires were extremely extensive. Kangaroo Island in South Australia, of course, was also badly affected by bushfires. I've been in Alice Springs, and I might talk about Central Australia for a moment. I do quite a lot of work in somewhere called the West Macdonald Ranges, which is in the country to the west of Alice Springs. And a few months earlier, there'd been a pretty major fire going through that country as well. That place still has a lot of Indigenous people on it. Now, I guess what happens is that what we're seeing and the way this impacts Indigenous communities is the fires are much more intense than they were. So we're getting completely different patterns of burning. And if you look at Central Australia, for example, the landscape, the vegetation has significantly changed. There are introduced grass species in the centre of Australia, including something called buffel grass, which is completely different to any of the vegetation you'd normally find. What happens is that when that grass dries out, it burns incredibly fiercely and it kills everything. A lot of the native species, it even kills the great river red gums that run along those great desert rivers like the Fink, which are incredibly ancient. And last year we did a trip down the Fink River. This is where the explorers were going down, 120 years ago, whatever the time was in the 1800s. A bit more than that, 130, 140 years ago. These are the first kind of Europeans doing these explorations. They described, the wildlife, which was prolific. So they saw various marsupials, lizards, all those things. Now you'd have to look very hard to find anything. So these countries are changing through climate change, through things like cattle stations, introduced grass species, and that changes the landscape forever. So how are you going to turn it back? How do you give those native species that live in these places, a chance? Many of those Central Australian species went extinct in the 1930s because that's when they fell over a cliff. You can read the histories of those things. What I suggest to people is when they come to Australia, they should go to museums, like you go to the museum in Alice Springs, for example, and you can see some of the histories of what happened. So we can look at these landscapes and see that they have changed dramatically. And for Indigenous people, this means a lot of the food plants have gone. If we can go, I'll take you on a journey further north from Central Australia to the top end of the Northern Territory. To the east of that, to the east of Darwin, if you like, there is Kakadu, and beyond that, there is Arnhem Land, which is one of the great paradises on earth. And this is basically a giant wetland in many of its parts and places. It is a special Aboriginal place, and it is intensely beautiful. I think the cultures are relatively intact. I mean, there are problems there, but many people live a very traditional life. And what we need to learn from those places and those people is how to look after, what happens in Australia. Because it is, for many people, what goes on is deeply distressing. And it is those kind of cultural human rights aspects of what occurs that I think are incredibly important. One of the things I'd like to do is just to touch on human rights in relation to wildlife. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the way that some of the wildlife carers in Australia have been treated. And that's without a lot of respect, I have to say. And this is all part of this sort of cultural issue that I was talking to you about. So often, wildlife carers struggle. They work very hard to look after animals, to bring them back, make them well again, if you like, only to release them and then have them shot by somebody. So we've got two different things going on. It's like a tug of war. So governments suggest that they're spending money on wildlife conservation, but they're also spending a lot of money on trying to get rid of it. So this is a great confusion, and it catches up a lot of people, in this sort of turmoil. And it is very distressing for many. And one of the issues that I've got is the people who live in regional Australia away from cities actually want to live there in peace and quiet. They don't want to be living in a place where there's either a commercial wildlife killing industry going on. You can imagine if you have a business in regional Australia, tourism industry business, yoga school, whatever it is, the last thing you want is a whole load of people shooting stuff around the property. And those are the sort of, disputive things that go on in some of these regional communities. And that needs tidying up. Because in Victoria, for example, we're now getting into a dangerous place where high-powered rifles are being used very close to people's properties to kill kangaroos. And that's a dangerous game. I think when we look back at the history of the Australian Wildlife Protection Council, what it demonstrates is 50 years of the same sort of struggle. Now, clearly, despite the efforts of the most wonderful people in the past, not much has changed. So my big question is, how do you actually change it? The politicians still behave in the same way, the departments of environment, and you have to put an inverted comma around that word environment, behave in the same way, which is not looking after the environment. So all those things go on. So we really need to get out to the general public, and we need to get out to the world, and this is why what you're doing is so great. And tell people these stories so that they understand. And the more people know, the better it is. And that's how we're going to make changes. And that's why the internet, social media, those things are becoming powerful. Now, my sense of it is that more and more people are understanding the situation. And I'm very happy to talk about it anywhere at any time. And I think the real issue here is when I look at small people, young people, I think, what on earth is their future going to be? We have temperatures of 50 degrees in parts of Australia now, and I'm often in places like that. And it shrivels up the land. What on earth is going to happen? And, the only thing that can happen is that human beings change the way they behave. And it's partly a global thing, but it's also very much a localized thing. And I think it is incredibly important that we all work together on this stuff. And, we connect our cultures. We think about our Indigenous friends, the Maasai, for example. In a drought, their animals die, the food crops die, they die. It's that straight connection to the earth. We're sheltered from those things because we live in cities, we've got bank accounts, and we can go to the shop and buy food. But we shouldn't think that's going to be the case all the time, because the earth will get us as well. So it's only a matter of time before that happens. And that's why we worry about the future of young people on the planet.